Our first presenter is Professor Gerrit Bloothooft from the Linguistics Institute at Utrecht University. His research interest happens to lie in the area of sociocultural background behind the naming of children and how the fashion for those names is diffused. His presentation is recorded and it's entitled "On the Diffusion of Popular International Given Names in Western Countries." Thank you.
My name is Gerrit Bloothooft from the Institute of Language Studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and entitled "On the Diffusion of Popular International Given Names in Western Countries." Given names reveal identity by the choice of parents. They may reflect language, culture, religion, and social status. Where in the past parents' choices were inspired or dictated by their close social environment and traditions, nowadays media, and especially social media, provides lots of new names that diffuse easily between countries. It is the diffusion of these new, fashionable names that has my particular interest. Why do some names gain high popularity while others are seldomly heard? To understand the popularity of given names in one country, in my case, the Netherlands, it is needed to know the developments in other countries as well. Since for several Western countries given name statistics have become available, there is an opportunity to investigate given name diffusion from a broad international perspective. In this talk, I will take the first step into this direction. It is important to realize that, in contrast to the past, given name choices are now highly governed by fashion, which implies that there is a continuous flow of new names that express parental preferences over time. These new names come and go with a lifetime of many decades. New names, however, are in many cases not really newly invented names. They may be a revival of old names, or they may originate in other languages and cultures. But, whether old or important, at some moment they can be considered new names for the parents in the country concerned. Parents have a high degree of freedom to choose given names for their children and express their identity through these. They may find inspiration in the names they are aware of in their social environment, which is where their children will grow up, but also from media such as journals, radio, and television, and more recently the social media. The inspiration has widened from local to national to international sources. Here's an example of how a given name can become popular. In this case, the female name Ingrid, which was until about a century ago unknown in the Netherlands. With 3 parameters, the development of the popularity of Ingrid can be described by a process of word by mouth. First, there's the year in which the name was given for the first time to a child, the starting year. Second, there is the speed of diffusion, which depends on the intrinsic properties of the name which are favored in the years of rise. And finally, there's the number of social networks through which the name is diffused and results in a maximum popularity of a name. I will not go into details of this model. It's just important to realize that a name comes and goes, and that the lifetime of a name can take several decades. As an example of fashionable names in the Netherlands, here are some names that became very popular with a starting year between 50 and 100 years ago, and reached their top between 1970 and 2000. It's noteworthy that only a few of these names are typically Dutch, such as Luc in this spelling, Remco, Marjolein, Fleur, and Merel. Many of these names, but not all, are English. To understand their rise in popularity, the international context in terms of long-term statistics from other countries is needed. To this end, we can use open source data on given names from bureaus of national statistics in different countries. Important issues with these data are, first, the starting year, which preferably is a century ago or earlier, to get a full view of the development of the popularity of a name, but these historic data are scarce. Second, in many cases, for reasons of privacy, names with lower frequency are not given. Third, counts may be given, but with some effort, percentages, which we need for comparisons, can be derived from the total number of births. And fourth, when only rank orders are given, this is less useful for comparisons. At the moment, I have available, and actually available to all of you, open source data from 8 Western countries or regions: the Netherlands, France, Norway, USA, Dutch-speaking Flanders in Belgium, French-speaking Wallonia in Belgium, Scotland, and England and Wales. There is considerable variation in the starting year, from 1790 for the Netherlands until from 1996 only for England and Wales. Also, the lower frequency limit varies. Scotland presents the data in full. Other countries have a lower limit between 3 and 5. Here are the countries concerned shown on a map. Of course, there are many missing countries, among which Germany and Mediterranean and Eastern European countries. Still, the data from the 8 countries or regions can provide a good start for Western Europe. And even better, by direct contact with bureaus of national statistics, I got more data for research purposes. For the Netherlands, I have full data available for research, while for Belgium, data from 1900 onwards were given. For England and Wales, the starting year could be advanced to 1982. Here then is the popularity of the given name Ingrid again, but now in Western European perspective. As expected, the name is traditionally Norwegian or wider Scandinavian, but a bit to my surprise with popularity peaks around 1920 and 2000. When in 1940 the popularity of Ingrid in Norway was relatively low, the name became popular in the Netherlands and Flanders, possibly influenced by the movie Casablanca with the Swedish actress Ingrid Bergman. Somewhat after the Netherlands and Flanders, Ingrid became popular in Wallonia and France. Ingrid did not make it to the English-speaking countries. An early example is the name Robert, with likely 19th century or earlier presence in many countries. After 1900, there is, although at different levels, a simultaneous rise in the USA, France, Wallonia, and Flanders. And a generation later, followed by the Netherlands, and again a generation later by Norway. For the UK, it's obvious that missing data before 1980 unfortunately obscure our view of early popularity. Note that Robert is acceptable in this spelling in all countries, although its pronunciation varies, from Robert to Robert. There are also names that are typically associated to a language or culture and are really new, such as Marjolein for the Netherlands. Invented by a famous author for his daughter in 1920, it later became quite popular. The popularity spread to Dutch-speaking Flanders as well. An indication of the international character of naming can be seen from the top names in various countries, shown here per decade until 1990 and annually later on. Take some time to look at them. There are quite a few names, but focus on the colors. The same names have the same color. Without going into detail, it's obvious that Laura dominated widely between 1980 and 2005, and currently it is Emma. Let's have a closer look at these two names. Here's the popularity of Laura, a name of traditional origin. The name became again fashionable, first in the USA in the 60s, followed by the UK in 1980. Again 10 years later, the rest of Europe followed. Currently the name is abandoned everywhere. The Germanic name Emma is traditional as well, but was entirely out of fashion around 1960. For Emma, it is the UK that took the lead, followed with a delay of 20 years by the other countries, and Emma is still a top name in the continent. A nice example of delayed adoption can be seen with Lisa, short of Elizabeth. With steps of 20 years, Lisa was fashionable in the US, the UK, and at the continent. Also for boys, there are top names that are widely spread in Western world. Thomas, Green, and Lucas stand out, but there are many more. Let's have a look at both of them. Traditionally, Thomas is widely known, but its popularity in the USA stands out. While in decline in the US, the name gained popularity in the UK in the 70s and soon followed by the continental countries. Thomas is now in decline everywhere. For Lucas, we find a very stable historic popularity in the Netherlands, a typical characteristic of traditional names in our country, and in the 50s in Flanders. But the great rise started in France and French-speaking Wallonia, followed at a lower level by the other countries. It's of interest that the short form Luc was typically popular between 1940 and 1980 in Belgium and actually preceded Lucas. A last example is Noah, nowadays everywhere in the Western world among the most popular names for boys, which started out of the blue around the year 2000, but was simultaneously adopted everywhere. So far, I presented examples which showed various ways by which names can become popular in the 8 countries. Why specific names become popular and when and where they are adopted is open for further research, but the current data are a good basis for that. Finally, I would like to take a bird's eye view to illustrate general developments in naming in Europe over the last 140 years. For the years between 1880 and 2020, I computed the least number of names needed to name 80% of the children. If low, this number shows that many children got the same name. If high, there is great diversity in names. The popularity of the top name is related to this. If many children get the same name, the percentage for the top name will be high. If the diversity of names is high, the top name will reach a much lower percentage. These are the results for girls, for the 80% number. There's a remarkable correspondence between all countries investigated. Until 1960, only around 100 names were sufficient to name 80% of the girls. After 1960, the increase in the number of names is considerable, with a rise to 500 and 3,000 names, with large differences between countries. The same pattern is seen for boys, at the same scale. Also for them, only around 100 different names were needed to name 80% of them before 1960. But the rise is much less pronounced than for girls. Between 300 and 1,250 names are currently sufficient to name 80% of the boys. As with the girls, there are differences between countries, but it is of interest that this difference is not strongly related to the number of births. The US has about 20 times more births than the Netherlands. but in both countries, about 1,250 names are sufficient to name 80% of the boys. With the growth of diversity in names, the popularity of the top name dropped. Where about 1900, Maria, Marie, or Mary was a name given to up to even a quarter of all girls, nowadays the top name is only given to around 1% of the girls, with little variation between countries. The importance of and the public focus on the top name is somewhat misplaced nowadays. Many more names deserve attention. The same pattern can be found for boys, again the same scale. For them, John and variants dominated in the past, but as with the girls, the percentage of the top name currently is around 1%, with little variation between countries. Very special is the position of Albert in Belgium during the First World War. The appreciated attitude of King Albert in this war initiated a never replicated hype by the naming of 20% of the boys. This brings me to my conclusions. Firstly, we see the development from tradition to fashion in naming in all Western countries, with the 60s of the previous century as the period of big change. Secondly, both national and international preferences of parents can be observed. Name choices specific to the own culture and language emphasize cultural identity, while international names indicate a wider Western cultural identification. The USA can be ahead in initiating name popularity, but names from other countries can be inspirational as well. Diffusion of names can be multi-directional, but more analysis are needed for a full overview. Finally, I hope I created enthusiasm on the subject, and I plead for cooperation to stimulate the access to more open source data from more countries, and for joint research to come to a better understanding of the underlying diffusion processes. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
While we're waiting for a couple of questions, I have a couple of questions for you. I'm fascinated, a couple of different things. Number one, how did you acquire your data set? And what are your plans in terms of expanding that data set? Thank you.
Most data sets are open source, so everyone can download them. But for Belgium and the Netherlands, I have the special relationship with the bureaus of national statistics by which I could get them. And I should say that these contacts with national bureaus of statistics are very important because the data sometimes have errors. So in contact with France, I was able to repair some data in France, and now I'm still working with Norway because their data are not flawless. But anyhow, it's just a matter of contacts, and I hope to reach more contacts to other to bureaus in other countries to collect more data, as I mentioned in my last slide.
Again, while we're waiting, I will ask another question.
Based on your Cleve, might have
Cleve, I'm so sorry, Cleve. Oh, I am so sorry. I can't multitask, obviously. Professor Evans, the floor is yours.
Don't worry about that. I of course, I really loved your presentation. I just want to point out that sometimes, though, when you look at your charts, since if there's a huge difference between the countries, you may maybe miss something. Like we talk about Ingrid, you said, well, it didn't go up in English-speaking countries. Well, it really did. It just didn't go up with Ingrid Bergman. It may not have become as hugely popular as it was in the Netherlands and other continental European countries, but it certainly did go up because of Ingrid Bergman in the US. It may not have gotten up into the top 50, but it was way higher than it ever had been before. And you can even see with Ingrid in the US, and it'd be interesting to know if you could pick this up in any other country, she had this huge scandal around 1950 where she became pregnant by Roberta Rossellini, the Italian director, when she was still married to her first husband, and which was in all of the, movie fan magazines of the United States at that time, and was a horrible scandal. Today, that wouldn't be a scandal probably in the way it was in 1950, but you could actually see suddenly a big drop in Ingrid in the US the year after that scandal came. And then a couple of years later, people forgive her and it starts going up again. So sometimes you can, see drops in things depending on something that's going on in the news, as well as, rises. So.
Thanks, Cleve. Yeah, actually, I had the data from the US, of course, which give data from the annual frequency of 4 onwards. So I should have seen Ingrid, I guess. So I will be surprised that if you say she was really popular, well, to some extent, not as popular as in the continent, but popular in the US, we should have a look at the data because, well, I didn't get this. But it is indeed a bit too much surprise that I didn't see this name in the US. That's right. And of course, public scandals have a negative influence on the popularity of a name, and in that sense, it is of interest to see whether this is a really European disinterest in a name or just in one country.
While we're waiting, I'll ask one more. Again, out of curiosity, when you run your analyses, were you able to identify names that were particularly quick to gain maximal popularity in the different countries?
Well, in general, I might say that the speed of diffusion is slower, let's say 50 or 70 years ago. So if you want to have a really quick rise, you should have that happened, let's say, in the last 20, 30 years. For instance, in the Netherlands, Dex was very popular within, let's say, 5 years, which is extremely fast. But usually names need about, let's say, 4 decades to come to the maximum popularity. And again, that's almost symmetric. It needs it will take 3 decades to lose that popularity. But indeed, the spread has increased. The speed of diffusion has increased over the last years.
Thank you so much. So that actually answers Alexa's question, which happened to be, do you think that the speed of diffusion is increasing?
Yes, well, that's a mixture. Okay. Maybe the variation among names. Some names will take a long time to become really popular, and other names are very quick. So yes, I think this is there's more variation in the speed of diffusion than in the past.
Excellent. I have another question for you. How did you account, this is from Anne, how did you account for spelling differences? For example, did you include Luke with Luke spelled L-U-C and Lucas, or did you separate them?
I separate all names by spelling. So, well, that's a good question, because, for instance, names that have a common spelling in many countries may rise jointly, while specific spellings may show deviant behavior. And yes, well, in some countries, also the Statistics Bureau take names that have a common origin together, and do not use spelling do not show the spelling variation that's still found there, because spelling does not only say something about the language spoken, but has also social consequences, social background, that some social groups take another spelling are more especially for longer names, are more creative and willing to take exceptional spellings, while the more educated parents prefer the original spelling, for instance, in a language. So, but I take every name as in any spelling different. I do not never take I do not combine given names on that issue.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? We have about 3 minutes. Okay, so Catherine says, I like the way you linked Ingrid to the movie Casablanca. How difficult would it be to conduct research on why parents named their children?
That's really difficult. Actually, it's in my view, for instance, Ingrid, there will be in the Netherlands, I think a couple of parents who think, well, this is interesting, such a name. They saw the movie and they gave the name to a child, and then it spread slowly, not just by the movie, but because in some social environment, the name Ingrid shows up with babies, and other parents like that name, not because of the movie, because they have they get to know children who had that name. And but yeah, well, so really the start of fashion is difficult to pinpoint, and you should also recognize that there are many starts of many new names that will raise in popularity, and actually most of them will not make it. Only very few, relatively very few, will make it to the top 100. And it's also of interest, of course, to see what happens to the other thousands of names. I found it interesting that before 1960, in all of the countries concerned, I studied, only 100 names were used to name many 80% of the children. I think there's a very low number, actually, a bit to my surprise, actually, and that all this development was found in all countries concerned. So there should be some general mechanism behind it, and not only to a traditional naming to come to only 100 names, but also a kind of general mechanism that currently the top name only reaches 1%, which is amazingly low. Actually, it shows an enormous diversity, and that all these countries come to that percentage. I find that very intriguing, and in this sense, my presentation also is only the beginning of more research, which is made possible by the availability of these popularity figures and percentage figures for over a long range. We really need a long range to come to a real understanding. Absolutely. So I hope to find more data.
No, it's very compelling. So I look forward to future presentations. I will end with a comment from Alexa, who says it's hard to imagine. It's hard to determine reasons imagined because parents are not always honest about why they named their children a certain name. My name, Alexa Rose, is technically a family name, but my father secretly confessed to some uncles that he was inspired by the singer of the popular 80s rock band, Axl Rose. So there you go. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. We'll move on to the next presenters.